In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the study of child development. So we're focusing on chapter 1. So as you're listening and reviewing the lecture sites, make sure to click on each of these icons for the lectures, or if you're watching on the video version, make sure to also pull up the lecture slides PowerPoint just in case you need to review the material and click on it on your own time. And without further ado, let's get into the study of child development. So it's important for us to just have knowledge on what human development is, and then once we have knowledge on that, we're better able to study children because children are human beings. And so we're looking at children and human beings at all different ages, and so hence why for this course we are focusing on conception all the way through adolescence, and we're looking at if during these points in our age and the circumstances that we have within our lives, do we change or remain the same over time? So a child who is aging out of preschool and entering into the public school system, do they change over time based on their age, or would they potentially change due to the circumstances of their school environment, or if something's going on in their home life, or would they remain the same with their development? And so we're looking at human development as a way to understand this. And we also look at human development through a scientific lens. And so just a quote here for you to kind of encompass that is that all kinds of people everywhere of every age live satisfying and productive lives. And so we're looking at development from this perspective in that we have to consider all different people and how they come from all different walks of life. And so human development, it's not one exact right answer. There are many different ways that we might be studying and looking at children and who they are as individuals. It's important to understand that we will look at human beings from a variety of different developmental domain perspectives, so biosocial, cognitive, and psychosocial, and we're going to get into these in detail as we move through the different lectures with our infants and toddlers, early childhood, middle childhood, and adolescence. So you'll see these terms being reutilized again over a period of time throughout the term. And so we will discuss biosocial development. So this is our physical and motor development, changes over time within our growth patterns, our bodies. Also, we're looking at genetic factors and also how nutrition and the environment affect our growth. And so I gave an example in each of these sections of a developmental aspect and how that might come into play. We also are looking at cognitive development, so that's really our thinking, how we think, the mental processes that we're going through, and how they relate to our imagination, our memory, our judgment. Our language is also incorporated within our cognitive development, so different processes on what we're looking at into thinking, deciding, learning, so problem solving, all of that is encompassed within cognitive development. And then our psychosocial development is looking at our emotions, our social connections, how we form friendships, our attachments that we have to our caregivers and other individuals within our lives. And we're also considering a social context within our community as well as within our cultures. And so we look again at how these things either remain the same or change over time within a developmental period. Now, it's not only important to consider the different aspects of human development, but how do we actually engage in studying child development? So when we're engaging in studying child development, we are looking at it from a scientific approach. And so within this, we use empirical articles. And so I've included a link here as to what an empirical research article is, and it's important that you take a peek at this because you're going to need to know how to actually look for empirical research, read empirical research, evaluate that research, and in the future hopefully you'll be able to engage in your own studies related to child development as well. And so we're looking again at using application of knowledge and understanding of the natural and social world related to young children. And so this is a multidisciplinary aspect of science. And so we're looking at it from many different perspectives, again, considering those different domains of development, such as cognitive and psychosocial. And we're also using this to lead to a practical application. So I'm not just getting information just to have. I'm using this information to better understand a human being. And so I might use this information in a practical setting, such as in a childcare or in a school. I might also use this information within a therapeutical session. And so I'm using this as information that can lead me to further develop an understanding of who a child is. It might be utilized in a more informal setting. So I might collect data and use empirical research just to better understand the children within the context of their classroom and within their peers, or even use this knowledge to better understand different kinds of families. And so this is also important to note that it's based on an objective evidence perspective. So I'm not just basing it on my own opinions. I have research that goes behind all of the things I'm doing in my developmental study. And so I have data that I'm collecting and analyzing, and I'm also utilizing this data to then form conclusions. So when we are working on developing a study, we often use the 5 basic methods for scientific inquiry. And so we are considering first that we have to come up with a question and have an initial curiosity to a topic. And so as you're moving forward within this course and other courses throughout your semesters and time in your degree, you're going to be proposed with a lot of different areas that might be interesting to you. And so that's the first step, is developing a question that you want to explore. And so this question has to have depth to it. It has to be something that can be open-ended. It's not just a one-word answer, but a question that can then lead into doing research and getting data, using participants. And so after you've come up with that question, you develop a hypothesis. And so this is something that can be tested out. So I'm considering specific predictions, ways that I can go about answering that question, and then I go and test my hypothesis. So this is when I'm getting all of the data that I need in order to answer my question. And so I'm collecting research, gathering data, and I'm using this data then to, number 4, draw my conclusions. And so I use then the data that I've collected to wrap up and say, based on the question that I proposed and the hypothesis that I developed, I ended up going and looking into preschool children. And maybe I wanted to look at whether or not preschool children are getting enough sleep during the time frame of their day at preschool. And so maybe I gathered research on different days and times that children attend the center. Maybe I collect data from caregivers and parents and ask them what their routines are with napping. And then I gather all this evidence and I draw my conclusions based on the data that I've collected. And I either support whether children are or are not getting enough sleep based on all that information, and then I write up my results. And so when you're going and looking at empirical research articles, you're reading a lot of what the results propose. You're also looking at some of the data that has been collected, but mostly you're looking up and reading the report of the results to see whether or not the theory or the hypothesis, the questions that were proposed, are true or disproved based on the research. There are also different ways that we might actually collect the data. And so the first one, and the most commonly used, is observation. And so this is something that we often do without even realizing it, informally, and we're collecting data through observing. And we also might do different kinds of experiments, and we also might use surveys. And so commonly when we're doing observations, we may also take notes and do running records, and then we can utilize that information later on to draw up our conclusions. Experiments might be that we're trying and testing different things out. So I might have a control group during this time and say, all right, I'm going to split up half of the room. Half of the room I'm going to allow extra time to get their work done, whereas the other half of the room I'm going to have a time limit, and I'm going to use that experiment to determine whether or not the proposed work that I want them to do can be completed within a certain amount of time. I might also ask surveys. So this is something common that we do with families all the time and teachers. And you take surveys, after you're done shopping. So surveys are a common form of research designs that we use day to day. And so these are the different types of research that we're going to be talking about and looking into throughout this course. When you're utilizing different types of research designs, you also might want to consider the kinds of people that you're studying. And so we have different kinds of research: cross-sectional, longitudinal, and cross-sequential research. And so with our cross-sectional research, this is looking at groups of people of one age compared to people of another age. So I might use that initial idea that I was speaking about earlier related to nap times. And maybe I want to consider the nap times if they are getting enough sleep during their time at school with the preschoolers, with the toddlers, and with my infants. And so I compare different age groups. And maybe I also even want to compare when children get into their teen years. Do they take naps? What does that look like? And so a cross-sectional research study would be comparing different age groups of people. And then with a longitudinal study, I'm going to be using the same participants over a period of time. So I might look at children from the moment that they start in the preschool until all the way when they're done with elementary school. And so I'm going to collect data over an extended period of time. So hence longitudinal, a long period of time, same participants, but over a period of time. So maybe I want to look at, based on different types of materials that I provide for parents and caregivers to use at home with children to work on different concepts of mathematics or vocabulary. If they use flashcards, for example, every single day over an extended period of time, what will the results be? And so I can look at multiple children over an extended period of time, maybe from the time that they're 5 years old all the way until they're 10 years old, whatever that might be. So I'm using data repeatedly on the same individuals as they get older. And then a cross-sectional research study would look at several groups of people. And so I'm looking at different ages and following them over different years. So this is a combination of your cross-sectional and your longitudinal research. And so we'll talk a little bit more about some of our stage theorists later on in the theories lectures. So Erikson and Piaget are two individuals who looked at research from a cross-sequential perspective. Excuse me, I said it wrong previously. Cross-sequential. It's also important to consider the replication of your research, and so hence why this slide is called process, not proof. And so it sometimes does take a process engaging in the research over an extended period of time or at multiple different time points, days, even weeks. And so consider that you might need to repeat your study using different participants, a different age group, different elements of diversity such as socioeconomic status or even other cultures. So for example, maybe the age group that I'm working with is not developmentally appropriate for the study that I'm considering, or I need a wider variety of people from different cultures in order to answer my question to the best of my ability. And so I need to get multiple different perspectives for this research to then answer the questions and hypotheses that I'm proposing. And so I might need to repeat the process. And that's really what we want to consider with this. And so we don't want to draw conclusions too quickly because we may need to revisit our study more than once. On this slide, we're talking about correlation and causation. And the big takeaway from this slide is correlation is not causation, but often what happens is we mix up the two. And so what we see is that we often have many different variables that are correlated with one another, but they're not the cause. So let's give an example. If we have students in school and their success rates on performance and doing better in school, and we say, oh, well, everybody who engages in extracurricular activities outside of school, such as dance or music or sports, they're automatically going to have increased student performance and that's going to rise. However, we see that there is a correlation between the two. However, one is not causing the other. And so the correlation between the two might be that students have more access to resources at home, they have more parental support, they have more ability to engage due to higher socioeconomic status, or they live in environments where they have more books that they can read or more extracurricular activities that they can participate in. But engaging in dance and music and sports outside of school is not causing you to do better on your testing or exams, but they could be correlated with one another. And so that's something that we have to consider when we're looking at research and collecting data, is causations versus correlations. You often may hear the common controversy of nature versus nurture, and really what this is it's an idea of looking at genes and how they influence our behavior, and then how the environment influences our behavior and affects development. And so we're going to talk more about some of this controversy and the elements of our genetics as well as the elements of our environment and what roles they play in impacting our behavior and affecting our development. And so we'll explore Bronfenbrenner a little bit more. And we'll look into schools, families, communities. We'll also consider different elements of parenting, those kinds of things. This class is going to touch on it slightly, but not in great depth. And just always something to consider is that nature always affects nurture and nurture always affects nature. So they are living in tandem with one another. Although there is controversy about it, we have research to prove that both nature and nurture impact human beings. It's also important when we are studying children and human beings to create opportunities for diversity, equity, and inclusion, so DEI. So when we're looking at doing studies, one consideration that you might need to look into if you're not already is opportunities for different cultures, different ethnic groups, different races, socioeconomic status, gender, age, ability, all these different elements of a human being might need to be your reconsideration for reapplication. So if you're not getting a wide range of results within a diverse profile of human beings, these are some areas that we might need to consider. And so there's just a little bit of information on some of these. We'll get into this in a bit more detail. We're not going to touch on specifics of how you're going to conduct research, but we will look at research studies that incorporate different elements of DEI. It's just important to have knowledge of this prior to starting any research that you might be doing, as well as when you're looking into empirical article research for this course. I do want you to consider what kinds of opportunities were created. Do we have a wide pool of people within a variety of different cultures? Are we only looking at one ethnic group? Are we only considering lower socioeconomic status students versus higher socioeconomic status students? Are we only looking at males versus females? What are the different elements of DEI that we are or are not considering? Last but not least, it's important to think about ethical considerations. Most importantly, we want to protect our participants, and they need to give informed consent in order to participate in any research that we're doing. I have included an example of a study that was done, Tuskegee syphilis study, and they basically did not get informed consent for many participants. Hundreds of African American poor men were subjected to this study and not provided accurate healthcare treatment. And so this video goes into a little bit of detail, on the harmful outcomes of this study and how ethical research was not being done during this time. And so we need to have oral and or written consent for any child, any participant, no matter what the age. It needs to be accurate, honest, and truthful. We need to give all the information up front to any individual who is going to participate in our studies. And so this is something to look into anytime that you're doing research or reviewing research. Was the procedure ethical?